Professor Noam Chomsky is listed in anybody's catalog as among the half-dozen top heroes of the New Left. This standing he achieved by adopting over the past 2 or 3 years a series of adamant positions projecting at least American foreign policy, at most America itself. His essays and speeches are collected in his new book, American Power and the New Mandarins. Usually, Mr. Chomsky writes non-political books, for instance, Syntactic Structures in 1957, Cartesian Linguistics in 1966, and Topics in the Theory of Generative Grammar, 1965. He is a highly esteemed student of modern language and linguistics who teaches nowadays at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and has taught before at Berkeley, Columbia, and other strife-torn universities. He is a member of many organizations and learned societies, including, I'm sure he would want me to mention, the Aristotelian Society of Great Britain. In one of his essays, Mr. Chomsky writes, quote, "By accepting the presumption of legitimacy of debate on certain issues such as this one has already lost one's humanity." I should like to begin by asking him why, under the circumstances, if by being here he stands to lose his humanity, he consented to appear in the first place.
Because, first of all, I didn't quite put it in those terms, I don't think. I think that but I think that I said that there are certain issues, for example, Auschwitz, such that by consenting to discuss them, one degrades oneself and to some degree loses one's humanity, and I think that that's true. Nevertheless, I can easily imagine circumstances in which I would have been glad to debate Auschwitz. For example, if there were some chance that by debating Auschwitz, it might have been possible to eliminate it or to at least mitigate the horror of what was going on. And I feel the same way about Vietnam. And I really think that fundamentally, there is no argument anymore at an intellectual level, in my opinion. But I think it's very important to discuss it nevertheless.
At what level is there an argument?
Well, there is a policy which I think is a destructive and devastating policy. It's continuing, and the continuation of the policy is, to some extent, based on the fact of public apathy or public acceptance. Hence, there still is the necessity to convince people that they should act strongly to put an end to this policy.
At what point was there an intellectual argument? At which point did an intellectual argument in favor of our intervening in Vietnam cease to exist?
Well, as I say there, I think that there may have been a time when there was something to debate. For example, I think that in the middle 50s, though I was opposed to the policy, and I think that it was right to be opposed to it, nevertheless, I think it was a debatable issue in a sense in which it is no longer a debatable issue.
Why is that?
Because at the moment, I think it's really an issue of the survival of the existence of Vietnam as an entity, as a social and cultural entity. I think that's what's at stake.
But even that could be intellectually argued, couldn't it?
Well, in the same sense in which Auschwitz could be intellectually argued.
No, I mean in a different sense.
No, I think in the same sense. In fact, don't forget there were people who argued in favor of Auschwitz and gave...
No, I haven't gotten that at all. I hadn't had any such on this program, nor do I intend to. But it seems to me that even if what you said were correct, there could be a perfectly legitimate argument over, for instance, the continuation of the state of Anguilla, or the continuation of the state of Biafra, or the continuation of the state of Goa.
I didn't talk about the existence of the state. I talked about the existence of the society as a social and cultural entity. I think that's what's at stake.
Oh, okay. Well, if it's at stake, mightn't there be 2 points of view about how to help it evolve into its natural forms, right?
Oh, there are many different points of view. I think they're very legitimate.
Well, now, how can you say
they're very legitimate? They're very legitimate issues that can be argued as to how the United States ought to most efficaciously put an end to its destructive actions in Vietnam. There are many different alternatives that might be thought about.
Yes, but one way, of course, to put an end to America's necessary intervention is to conclude the war successfully. That's a way, right?
One possible way is by destroying Vietnam, which I think is probably the most likely outcome.
Yeah. Well, now, for instance, one way in which we put an end to the Nazi occupation of France was by destroying Nazi Germany, correct?
That's right.
And it seems to me that this was a position which is a tenable position, and mutatis mutandis, it's a terrible position
No,
to take.
because mutatis mutandis
Well, explain to
changes
me
everything
why.
in this
Explain
case.
to me why.
Because in this case,
as you know, it's not only I,
yeah.
but people with whom I disagree, like
Yes, I
Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who refers to your theological certitudes
Yeah.
and your liberal application of them to every subject in which you touch. So the subject of your own intolerance of other people's point of view is, I think, itself linguistically interesting.
First of all, I don't accept that criticism. You see, if you look at that quotation, you'll notice that I put it in there, and recall the context. I said that when I argue the issue, I feel a tone of moral and emotional falseness, which I want to explain, but then I go ahead to argue the issue. So that's a side remark intended to explain my own feeling of emotional and moral falseness, which is real. I do feel it. But nevertheless, I then go ahead for 300 pages or so to discuss this and related
Sure,
issues.
yeah, but
so I don't really believe that it's fair to say that I'm not
On
willing
the other
to tolerate
fact,
other positions.
Yeah, the trouble is you don't end the book by saying, I'm kind of odd in feeling this. You say, everybody is odd who doesn't agree with me, right?
No, I don't think so. Do I
Well,
say that?
this is certainly the burden of your book.
I wasn't aware of that. Yeah. I mean, I think that I've given, an argument.
Well,
that
maybe this
expresses
is
what I
maybe
feel.
this is a universal difficulty you're having, not being aware of certain
perfectly
people's
possible,
reading of your position.
Well, then let me say, I think there are, for example, I think I take a very qualified and temperate position on many, many issues in this book. For example, take the issue of the background of the Second World War, which I spent a lot of time on. If you notice, I end up with a statement saying that I don't see any way to give a clear, sharp resolution, clear, sharp answer to the question what we should have done under such and such circumstances. I discuss someone who did take a very strong and I think very honorable position, namely A.J. Musty, and I say that I wish I could answer the question for myself whether I feel that I would have taken or would have rejected that position, but I don't see any way to do it because the issue is mixed.
No,
and on many issues, I feel that way. On the other hand, see, when the issue is when the issue is, let's say, 3 million tons of bombs dropped on Vietnam, I don't feel that way anymore. Nevertheless, I'm still perfectly willing to argue the issue calmly, quietly, and
as you would have, say, the dropping of the bombs in Dresden.
Exactly, or the atom bomb, let's say. See, I
But,
would have been willing to argue the dropping the atom bomb, though I do feel that it's a war crime.
Sure, but I do think that you put some people at a disadvantage by your a priori assertion that any position that disagrees with your own is intellectually barren.
Well, I didn't mean that, really. Let me explain. Maybe it didn't come across, but what I meant was something else. I wanted to honestly state my own emotional and my own feeling about entering into a debate over this issue.
Sort of Portnoy-wise?
No, I think that the point is that I think it's only fair to an audience of readers to say this is the way I approach the issue, and you read me on the basis of this understanding the best I can give as to the way I'm approaching this issue. And it's perfectly true that when I do, if you notice what I say is that increasingly over the years in discussing this issue, I felt this feeling of emotional and moral falseness. And I think it would only be honest to express it.
Sure.
Then to go ahead with the discussion.
Oh, quite so. But you also say that you hate yourself for not having come to that position earlier.
Yeah, I do. I think that was a very great mistake.
Well, I hope to give you a little solace in the course of the evening. But the reason I do raise this, and I rejoice in your disposition to argue the Vietnam question, especially when I recognize what an act of self-control this must involve.
It does.
Sure.
It really does. I mean, I think that
And
this is
you're
the
doing
kind
very
of
well.
issue
You're
where
doing very well.
Sometimes I lose my temper. Maybe not tonight.
Maybe not tonight. Because if you would, I'd smash you in the goddamn face. You say in your
Good
book,
reason for not losing my temper.
you say the war is simply an obscenity, a depraved act by weak and miserable men.
Including all of us. Including myself.
Well,
including that's the next sentence. Same sentence.
Sure, because you count everybody in the company of the guilty.
I think that's true in this case.
But
See, one of the points I was
this is a sense of theological observation, isn't it?
No, I don't think so.
Because as somebody points out, if everybody's guilty of everything, then nobody's guilty of anything.
No, I don't. Well, no, I don't believe that. See, I think the point that I'm trying to make, and I think ought to be made, is that the real, at least to me, I say this elsewhere in the book, what seems to me a very, in a sense, terrifying aspect of our society and other societies is the equanimity and the detachment with which sane, reasonable, sensible people can observe such events. I think that's more terrifying than the occasional Hitler or LeMay or other that crops up. These people would not be able to operate were it not for this apathy and equanimity. And therefore I think that it's, in some sense, the sane and reasonable and tolerant people who should who share a very serious burden of guilt that they very easily throw on the shoulders of others who seem more extreme and more violent.
No, I agree, but surely the emotional temperature of yourself or of myself or of other people is not in and of itself an index, an automatic index to the righteousness of our emotions.
Certainly not.
As
I
we
wouldn't
know, for
mean it to be
instance,
intended to.
people were approximately equally wrought up in the late 30s over whether or not America should help the Western powers to defend themselves against the Axis powers. And I think it is incorrect to suppose that people of either side were necessarily right simply because they were exercised.
Oh, I'd agree with that totally.
Yeah.
There's no connection whatsoever between you know, degree of emotion and degree of correctness.
But as you understand the existing situation, it ought to be, in your judgment, a transparently evil thing that we are engaged in, and you are derivatively concerned because there isn't, because there is not a shared sense of indignation like
right.
your own.
Now, I don't say that I am right because I am indignant. Rather, I say that I think in this case I am right to be indignant, which is different. I have to prove that.
You are right to be indignant if you are right.
That's right, and that has to be demonstrated. That's why
that
I
has
have,
to be demonstrated, which
you
is
know,
why
dozens of pages of argument about
Sure.
it, which may or may not convince people, convinces
Sure.
me. Yeah.
Sure.
But I agree.
All right, well, let me then, excuse me, did I interrupt you? I'm
No,
sorry.
go ahead.
Let me ask you this. If, in fact, your concern is to communicate your moral concern, to what extent have you spent a time thinking about your techniques? Now, I say this seriously because it is probably true that under certain circumstances, the communication of one's own indignation and fury and restraint is best communicated emotionally, i.e. to one's own satisfaction, by screaming and yelling.
Right.
But if it becomes observable that this doesn't bring people around, then you've got to consider the problem of communication, which it becomes a moral problem, just as you would consent to argue Auschwitz or Buchenwald with somebody if there was a chance of dissipating something of the sort. Now, if you have given that problem any thought, how come that you end up saying, as you do in your book, that Senator Mike Mansfield is, quote, the kind of man who is the terror of our age?
Well, let me put that in its context as well. What I say is, I believe that, and what I say is that Senator Mansfield is an American intellectual in the best sense, a sane, reasonable, scholarly man, the kind of man who is the terror of our age. And that's essentially what I was saying before. I think that the terror of our age is the
mass man,
the sane, responsible, serious, quiet man who watches these things unfold and doesn't react to them. I include myself in that, as I tried to make clear in the earlier statements.
Well, if, put it this way, your counsel is surely a counsel of despair if, on the one hand, you accost us with your own relative moral superiority and yet end up despising yourself, appealing to scrupulosity for your own shortcomings. I mean, this makes things pretty...
Not really. For one thing, I don't feel any relative moral superiority, and I tried, maybe failed, but I tried very hard to express that in the book. That I said somewhere in the beginning that if there is any tone of self-righteousness or anything like that, it's unintended and certainly undeserved, and I mean that very much. See, I mean, after all, given the feelings that I have, which I've just expressed, you know, and which you perceive, I should be doing really strong things, which I don't think I am doing. So there's no sense of moral superiority, and I'm not interested in simply, you know, throwing blame around or giving people marks. I think that the beginning of wisdom in this case is to recognize something about what we stand for in the world, what we're doing in the world. And I think when we do recognize that, we will feel an enormous sense of guilt. And I say somewhere in there that one should be very careful not to let confessions of guilt overcome the possibility of action. I say that confessions of guilt can be very good therapy, as they can, as is well known. They're also very good preventative to action. And I think one should be very wary of that. In fact, if I remember...
Well, I think we should.
I have some remarks
I think
about
that your formulation of it is at least saintly, but it still is dislocating, at least, to people who fancy themselves as spending an equal amount of time attempting to refine their whole apparatus of moral discrimination and who come up with conclusions directly at variance with your own. Now, the reason I haven't asked you at this moment to say, why are we in Vietnam and such and forth is because we've been all arguing about this for 4, 5, 6 years, and the chances of our coming up with anything, especially new, are small.
Yeah, that's one of the respects in which I think it is sort of an unarguable issue. Now,
Yeah.
The issues have just, one has been over them over and over and over again.
Yeah, yeah. But there are perhaps certain aspects of the quarrel in Vietnam that touch especially on your thesis and your concern and the whole nature of it. And that is the suspicion that some people have of a double standard, of selective indignation. For instance, you refer to the heroic Vietnamese resistance to American power.
I think it's absolutely heroic.
Yeah, sure.
Amazing.
Now, I understand I understand enough about language to understand the use of heroism in that way.
If you notice, there are a few lines below, I say, or above, I say something about quite apart from any question of politics.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Right. Now, suppose I were to write about the heroic resistance of the Nazis to the Liberation Army, for instance, their use of torture, the use of mass reprisals.
I don't consider that heroic.
Well, why isn't that heroic? I mean, that means that they were doing everything they possibly could.
No, I don't think that heroism doesn't. Well, then I think we do disagree on the use of language. I don't think that reprisals against
we do know that Viet Cong have used fire weapons to destroy whole villages, children, that they have disemboweled mayors and so on and so forth and hung them up and all that kind of stuff. Now, this is heroic, I understand.
No, that is not. Oh. That's depraved.
That's depraved.
In my opinion. Yeah.
So
but that's very, very marginal in the Viet Cong.
Well, why is it marginal?
In fact, it's marginal. That's a question of fact. And
it's a question of fact,
yeah. The question, in fact, it's quite, I think there's perfect unanimity about this in the people who've studied it. For example, if you look at someone like, say, Douglas Pike, American Foreign Service agent, as the chief expert on the Viet Cong, and you read his book carefully, you discover that he points out that it was in response to the American military effort that the Viet Cong turned from their attempt to build mass popular support by through the organizational methods that involved giving people an actual role in organizing and controlling their own society and institutions. They turned from that to physical force in reaction to the American intervention. Well, and if I have many examples of this quoted in the book from aid documents, let's say, or from pacification manuals where people point out...
By the same token, you can say that the Nazis turned to torture in France in reaction to Eisenhower's landing in Normandy. The answer is that people so disposed to act are certain kinds of people, and I yearn for a recognition of this in your writings or in Douglas Pike's. As a matter of fact, Douglas Pike, as you know, has certain difficulty with the fact that it is acknowledged that up to 25,000, 30,000 people were individually killed by terrorists before.
When was that?
America's, it was between 1958 and 1962.
I think a 9,000 is the figure that's given usually.
Well,
right, and it's interesting to see what it was. I mean, if one really wants to talk about Viet Cong terror during the period prior to the American intervention, then again, I think just about all commentators, Dennis Werner, Bernard Fall, whoever you like, has agreed that by and large, this was terror directed extremely selectively against oppressive and external village officials.
The burning of Joan of Arc was selective.
Pardon?
The burning of Joan of Arc was selective, too.
But I think
the point is it was intended to establish a universal point.
It was
so was the
intended
execution of Eichmann selective.
Well, but you see, there's a very big difference. I think, you see, if you want to, personally, I'm against all kinds of terror, no question. But if you want to understand the Viet Cong situation, then let's recognize a very great distinction, at least I recognize. Let's see what the political point of the terror was. See, after all, during that period, there were about 9,000 or 10,000, according to American sources, there were maybe 9,000 or 10,000 village officials of one sort or another killed by the Viet Cong, largely with the support of the villages. But at the same time, recall that there were perhaps 160,000 Vietnamese, if we accept Bernard Fall's figures again, killed by the Saigon government and the Americans. This is prior to 1965. That was a very different kind of terror, both in quantity and also in its political content.
Yeah, I know, but it seems to me that you are attempting here to match things which are not equal.
No, 9,000 and 160,000 are by no means equal, nor is the political point.
I need to say that. I'm prepared to answer. My point is that one presumably distinguishes between an act of terrorism, which you called depraved a moment ago, and
what you described, like burning a village, is depraved.
Yeah, a military action
which is equally
part
depraved,
of military operation.
which is even more depraved. For example, you see, well, let me give you some examples of what I consider depraved actions. Malcolm Brown, back in 1962 or 3, I don't remember, reported, it was I think AP or UP correspondent, reported that Saigon officials were sending American Skyhawks, airplanes over Vietnamese villages to wipe them out with napalm raids in order to cover instances of graft, for example. Well, that's, I think, depraved. Incidentally, I don't condemn that because, you see, just to mention this matter of double standard, there are really three kinds of terror in Vietnam. There's Viet Cong terror, there's the Saigon government terror, and there's American terror. And if you read what I've written, I say practically nothing about either Viet Cong terror or terror carried out by the Saigon government. Now, if one wanted to talk about that, one would have to point out that the terror carried out by the Saigon government is incredibly greater in extent and has a very different political purpose, which one could discuss. But I restrict myself to discussing American terror.
On that generality, but,
well,
but I gather that you believe it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do, and we could, that then does become a matter of fact, which one could discuss. Yeah, but I, as a matter of principle, almost restrict myself to the discussion of American terror. Not the terror carried out by the various sides in Vietnam, for many reasons. For one thing, because it's just qualitatively different in scale, and for another thing, because I feel that we have some responsibility for it. See, I don't. In the same sense, I don't talk about, I've never written about the terror carried out by both sides in Nigeria, let's say. I don't like it, obviously, but I don't see any point in my giving them good or bad marks for it. On the other hand, if we were carrying out the terror, I would very definitely write about it. And I think, so there's no double standard as far as I can see. At least, let's say I have a standard in mind, one may or may not accept it.
We will explore that.
Okay.
Mr. Chomsky, we're talking there about American terror, and I think you make a very accurate observation that we are responsible for what we do, but hardly responsible for what other people do, except insofar as we are in a position to influence them.
That's right.
For instance, if there is a mass starvation in Biafra, even though we did not cause it, there is a sense in which we are responsible if we don't do something to attempt to alleviate it. Right. Now, by the same token, if we are prepared to agree that it is not always easy to taxonomize military action into that which is terroristic and that which is purely a military operation, we are left with doubts, for instance, about the bombing of Germany in 1942, 43, 44. Mm-hmm. You might contend that this was terroristic and unnecessary, and you might be right, although you're not a military expert, neither am I. But I think
there's a point to that.
Yeah, but I do judge that even if we all agree that what we did in Dresden was inexcusable, as a moral question, it's got to be understood in context of what was it that brought us to Dresden in the first instance.
Absolutely.
And what brought us to South Vietnam in the first instance, in my judgment, was clearly an uninterested, or I should say disinterested, concern for the stability and possibilities of a region of the world, to which we were
period at what period do you feel that we had this disinterested relationship to Vietnam?
Right now.
No, at what period did we have it? Did it begin, let's say, 1951, for example? When the State Department bulletin points out that we must help the French reconquer their former colony, and we must eradicate all Vietnamese resistance down to its last roots in order to reestablish the French in power. Was that disinterested?
To increase my vulnerability, I wish we had helped the French.
We did. We supported them.
Not sufficiently.
Well, but
there's no point in helping somebody insufficiently.
It was hardly disinterested when we attempted, as with tremendous support, in fact, to reinstate French imperialism in South Vietnam.
Now, it was disinterested in this sense, and I think this is an important distinction which you do touch on in your book. It's a disinterested act if my attempt to help, or your attempt to help a particular nation, is in order to spare you the possibility of a great ordeal in the future, which will harm you, your family, your children, your republic.
And in that sense, Nazi Germany was also disinterested.
Yeah,
after all, Nazi Germany was conquering Eastern Europe only in order to advance the values of Christian spiritual civilization and to restore the Slavs to their rightful home and so on and so forth. Totally disinterested.
Look, I follow you. But if you want me to pursue that digression, I will.
Okay.
But let's suspend it for a moment. Okay. I'm distinguishing that kind of disinterestedness between the kind of...
But that's not a kind of disinterestedness. You see, that's something which includes as a special case every case of military aggression and colonialism in history. It's all disinterested in your sense.
Well, all right, let me simply rest my case by saying that there is an observable distinction by intelligent men between a country that reaches out and interferes with the affairs of another country because it has reason to believe that a failure to do so will result in universal misery, and that country which reaches out and interferes with another country because it wants to establish Coca-Cola plants there and chase national banks and whatever and exploit it. Now, that is an observable
It's a conceptual
distinction.
well, let's distinguish between a conceptual distinction and a factual
I'm prepared
distinction.
to do that.
All right, it is a conceptual distinction, but in actual fact, the history of colonialism shows that these two motivations can coincide. That is, practically every, I mean, there are exceptions, you know, probably the Belgians and the Congo are an exception, but by and large, the major imperialist ventures have been in the economic, in the material interest or in the perceived material
I'm not
interest.
interested in the mathematics, but I'm interested.
Let me finish.
You have already conceded that it's not merely a conceptual difference.
I say it is.
There are exceptions.
There are a few exceptions.
All right.
Like say
Okay.
but
All right, let's talk about the exceptions then.
well, no, but the exceptions are at the difference. No, wait a minute. The exceptions I mentioned, for example, the Belgians and the Congo. There, they didn't even pretend to have a civilizing mission. There, it was pure material self-interest. These are the exceptions. There are, as far as I know, no exceptions on the other side. There are. I mean, maybe I've left out a case of history, but as I see the history of colonialism, the great mass of cases are cases where a powerful country was working in its perceived material self-interest and was covering what it was doing to itself and to the world with very pleasant phrases about preserving Christian values or helping the poor benighted natives or one thing or another. Now, there are a few exceptions where there was pure predatory imperialism. No, not even any pretense of doing anything, but these are quite rare.
Well,
and we're in the mainstream
not
of imperialism in this sense. Pure predatory imperialism?
Sure, the history of the Roman Empire.
Well, let's take one. I mean, since the Industrial Revolution.
Since the Industrial Revolution. Well,
you know,
if you say that people have refined the art of apologetics, I don't deny it. But it is also true, and I think manifestly true, that there have been interferences with the affairs of other nations whose purposes were, in my judgment, manifestly benign.
For example?
Well, for instance, the Truman Doctrine.
Oh, I don't think that was manifestly benign at all. That was an attempt to
well, the Greeks
develop an
benign. I think the
Greek situation was benign? Not at all. We were
I say the Greeks' testimony is more interesting to me than yours.
Which Greek testimony?
The testimony
of the thousands of people who were thrown into jail and,
I grant not the testimony of the Greek communists who were beaten.
Or the Greek peasants who were,
there again, is it a conceptual difference that between the person who desires a life under some kind of freedom and one who desires life under some kind of, under communism?
No, because there's no such opposition in Greece. There was a distinction between a very repressive regime, which we instituted in 1946, and another regime, I don't know what it would have been, that would have grown out of a victory of the so-called communists. Now, if you see, what we did had nothing to do with freedom. What we instituted was
This is absolute historical romantic, I would say, because
the
number of people who were slaughtered in Greece, first by the communist insurgency, then by the Nazis, then again by the communists, add up to an enormous
communist insurgency before the Nazis? Which one?
Not insurgency, conquest.
Communist conquest before the Nazis
communist
in Greece?
Insurgency.
Prior to the Nazis in Greece?
Yes, the Civil War of the early 40s.
My point is
that the Greeks...
your history is quite confused.
No, that's not bad at
There
all.
was no communist insurgency prior to the Nazis. There were communist resistance bands that fought against the Nazis.
This is a matter of nomenclature. The point is that the 40-year-old or the 45-year-old Greek has fought 3 times in certain ventures, in one of which they acknowledged that we bailed them out.
Who is they? Who is they? The rulers of Greece acknowledge that.
No, also the people.
I'm quite unaware of that. I'm quite unaware that the people of Greece have spoken on this issue.
Even Papandreou, you like him, I assume, because he hates us.
No, not at all.
Papandreou.
Not at all. George Papandreou was one of the people who was...
I'm talking about Andrea, which makes it even...
Has Andreas Papandreou
They're both on record as being grateful to President Truman for his intervention in that part of the world in 1947.
Well, in that case, I disagree with him on that issue. I mean, I really do. I think we had no right to intervene in Greece in 1947.
No, now we're talking about rights,
and
which gets us away from the discussion.
All right, let's talk about whether we did it
whether or not there is such a thing as relatively disinterested international interference. And it seems to me that America's record is rather good. We went through an imperialist phase, but we pulled out of it faster than any country in the history of civilization.
I think we're very deep.
Why did we pull out of the Philippines, for instance?
We pulled out of the Philippines because it became a bad investment.
Why?
Because if you look, American agricultural interests were very much opposed to the, back in the mid-30s, they were very strongly opposed to the free trade relationships which allowed Philippine crops to compete with them. That's why we pulled out of the Philippines.
Why do these agricultural interests authorize us to intervene in South Vietnam?
They did.
If you consider this is
because we didn't intervene on the
basis. This is the critical dimension.
No, I say that in the Philippines it was the critical dimension. Look, the world is a complex place.
I'm aware of
There
that.
are certain interests that were involved.
MIT is a complex place.
Well, there were certain interests that were involved in our Philippine venture. There are different interests that are involved in our Vietnam venture. You see, our Vietnam. Don't forget that with the Second World War, America's imperial interests expanded enormously. I mean, prior to the Second World War, we were sort of a marginal imperialist power, except for the Monroe Doctrine. But since the Second World War, we became the world's major imperialist power. And Vietnam is simply one piece of an attempt to construct a very large integrated world system, of which Greece was another piece.
Yeah, we became an imperial power, Mr. Chomsky, in the sense that we inherited primary responsibility for any chain of action that might involve us in a Third World War.
I don't believe
and something that might involve the entire world in Holocaust. And
no,
under the circumstances, well, I know you don't believe it, but
in fact, I think that
it might be refreshing to listen to this point of view, which is that there are people who do believe that America, unhappily and certainly not desiring it, inherited the responsibility for trying to abort international Holocaust, and has from time to time done so by such ventures as the Truman Doctrine, martial aid, and things like that.
No, I don't agree.
With martial aid not disinterested.
No, martial aid is quite different. First of all,
I'm sorry. Yeah. I interrupted you, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you've now mentioned martial aid for the first time, and Marshall Plan aid has to be distinguished quite sharply from the Truman Doctrine.
Why?
Why? Because the Truman Doctrine was a doctrine of military intervention, and the Marshall Plan was our first attempt at a major aid program.
But you do understand that sometimes
just
a soldier can be as useful as a bushel of wheat, don't you?
No, look. Nevertheless, if we're going to be at all clear about the American role, we're certainly going to distinguish between military intervention and economic intervention. They're very different in the way they function. Now, the fact of the matter is that neither was disinterested in your sense, I don't think, but they're very different in the impact that they had. The Truman Doctrine, I think, was a disastrous venture. I think the Marshall Plan was arguable. I mean, one understood what
how do you
for,
explain the schizophrenia?
I don't agree with it.
How do you explain the schizophrenia of a public which willed both more or less simultaneously? On the one hand, you say that the public is incapable of acting disinterestedly.
The public didn't will either.
Well, the government, all right, the
government. Because both were...
But the government backed by the public, how's that? How do you explain that the same government on Monday did the Truman Doctrine, which you consider simply sort of being a projection of the evil impulses of the government, and on Tuesday did something which you consider to be very good? What happened to the government between Monday and Tuesday?
First of all, I didn't say I considered it to be very good. I said it's rather different, and one has to bring different standards to bear in evaluating it.
Why is it different? Let me give you an example. Suppose you're a farmer.
Because there's a difference between receiving...
And you need agriculture. You need fertilizer, so you apply to me for fertilizer. But just before I get it to you, somebody comes up with a bayonet and is about to make it impossible for you to continue farming. Now, in that particular instance, is there a strategic difference between my giving you the fertilizer and my giving the soldier who routs?
That's not. So you're talking about the dream world. The real world is one, because the real world is one in which the alternatives were coming with a bayonet, which is on an American rifle held by an American-backed Greek soldier, and the alternative to that was giving the kind of aid which was used, in fact, to construct the kind of society in Western Europe that we wanted to see developed there. Now, these are two very different things. It's a very different thing to introduce, to run for the Greek army a counterinsurgency program with military support and many military men involved. That's one kind of thing, one sort of repression imposed on the Greek population through American intervention. One might argue whether it's right or wrong, but that's to be very sharply distinguished.
Why do you say imposed? Why do you say imposed? Is it because your presumption here...
My presumption is that
your presumption here is that the Greeks would like the kind of regime which resulted...
My assumption is that all intervention is imposed by any country. That is, you see, I believe that quite generally...
Did we impose on the French when we liberated them from the Nazis? Was that an imposition?
We didn't conquer France. We moved the Germans out of just from an outside invading force.
We invaded
But we didn't conquer it from its own people. See, in Greece, we were trying to conquer it from its own people.
But there you're willing to credit the anti-Nazis as their own people, but you're not in Greece willing to credit the anti-communists as their own people.
The German army was there. There was no outside army in Greece other than ours.
Look, there are modalities of outside intervention.
But look, there's a very sharp difference between... just a minute, there's a very sharp difference
Laval was not a Nazi.
But Laval wouldn't have lasted for 5 minutes without the German army.
And nor would Makarios have lasted for 5 minutes without the help of Russian aid.
But wait a minute.
In fact, as you know, when Stalin got tired of Makarios, he pulled out.
But look, now let's be careful again. I mean, there's a difference between... First of all, I'm opposed to military aid to other countries, whether by us or by the Soviet Union. Well, let's come back to that because it's a more important thing. And that is that I'm even far more opposed to the imposition of regimes by foreign troops. Now, in the case of Germany, let's say, in the case of France, the Pétain-Laval government, the Vichy government, was supported by German troops. Had the German... they weren't throughout the country necessarily, because there was certainly indigenous support, but there's no question that if German military force had been withdrawn to the other side of the Rhine, then there would have been an overthrow of the Vichy government, and France would have had some different form of government. Now, in that case, our invasion of France was, whether one likes it or not, was in reaction to an occupying external force. It's just pure confusion to identify that with the case of Greece, when we were trying to liberate, we were trying to select the kind of society that Greece would have, and we were trying to save the rulers that we had designated as appropriate from their own population. There were no outside forces.
But don't you realize that in your book, and that's why you're not willing to be consistent in carrying out this argument, you're constantly talking about our satellizing of places like Cuba and the Dominican Republic and so on and so forth, and yet we never occupied them in the sense in which you're talking about.
Well, we never occupied the Dominican Republic. We sent 25,000 troops there in 1965 in an occupation.
No, I'm talking about I'm talking
well,
about
the American Marines were in there dozens of times since 1900.
I think you're being evasive, and I don't think you want to be.
No,
Let me ask you this. Is it possible?
It's not evasive at all.
Is it possible?
You know, we just simply repeatedly sent troops to Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, et cetera, et cetera.
Is it possible to satellize a nation without having an occupying army there?
Yes, it is.
All right. Then there goes your tedious French explanation.
Oh, not at all, because that doesn't happen to be the... You see, we're talking about a real situation.
Yeah.
We could talk about some ideal situation and, you know, have an academic discussion about it.
I'm saying, therefore, it is possible for North Vietnam to satellize South Vietnam, presumably, without even
it's logically possible, but it
occupying it
didn't
militarily and in a formal sense.
But it didn't happen, though. So
well, this is an argument considering which there are 2 points of view.
Well, let's discuss it then.
Historically.
Yeah, in fact, you see, there's much more, if you want to be serious about it, there's more evidence that South Vietnam tried to colonize North Vietnam than conversely. In fact, South Vietnamese commandos were going, military forces, regular military forces, were going north considerably earlier than the time when we even proclaimed that the infiltration began from north to south.
Did they bump into the refugees coming south?
The refugees were coming south were going in both directions, in fact, in 1954-55, and at least according to Bernard Fall, the commandos began going north in 56 or 57. The first claimed infiltration from the north was in 59, and that was South Vietnamese coming south. So if one wants to talk about, again, the real world, the first motion of...
The trouble is, your difficulty with Chomsky is, in my judgment, you never know where neatly to begin your historical
well, you choose
sequence.
The point of beginning.
Well, the point really is that if you're starting to say that 1959 was a provocation because there was...
No, it wasn't a provocation. I say that's when we claimed that the provocation began.
But how about the people who were going from north to south who were talking about the misery that had been brought about Ho Chi Minh and so on and so forth?
When was that? Well, which people are you talking about? I don't know.
Well, I'm talking about Vietnamese north and south. Your trouble, I think, is neatly captured in the remark made recently by Czechoslovakia, that Czechoslovakia is, after all, the most neutralist country in the world, since it declines to interfere even with its own internal affairs.
I'm afraid I don't see the relevance of that remark.
Well, the relevance is very simply that you start your line of discussion at a moment that is historically useful for you.
That's what I say, you pick the beginning.
Of the post-war world is that the communist imperialists, by the use of terrorism, by deprivation of freedom, have contributed to the continuing bloodshed, and the sad thing about it is not only the bloodshed, but the fact that they seem to dispossess you of the power of rational observation.
May I say something?
Sure.
Yeah. I think that's about 5% true, and or maybe 10% true. It certainly is.
Why do you give that?
May I complete a sentence?
Sure.
I mean, it's perfectly true that there were areas of the world, in particular Eastern Europe, where Stalinist imperialism very brutally took control and still maintains control. But there are also very vast areas of the world where we were doing the same thing. And there's quite an interplay in the Cold War. You see, what you just described is I believe, a mythology about the Cold War, which might have been tenable 10 years ago, but which is quite inconsistent with contemporary scholarship.
Ask a Czech.
Ask a Guatemalan, ask a Dominican, ask a person from the Dominican Republic, ask a person from South Vietnam, ask a Thai.
Well, obviously we can't get away. If you can't distinguish between the nature of our venture in Guatemala and the nature of the Soviet Union's in Prague, then we have real difficulty.
Explain to me the difference.
Sorry. Mr. Greenfield.
Mr. Chomsky, you state in one of the essays in your book, the unpleasant fact is that if one wishes to pursue the Munich analogy, there is only one plausible candidate for the role of Hitler, and by that you mean the United States. There are other references to Nazi Germany's conduct of foreign policy and our own. And you also less emphatically suggest that a lot of the internal policies of the United States government have left millions of its own citizens hungry or exploited. If this is the fact, that is to say, if the nature of our society is functionally indistinguishable in this respect from Nazi Germany, then doesn't that legitimate any tactic that one wishes to use in opposition?
Well, I certainly don't believe that your assumption. That is, I don't believe, and I don't think I ever say that our society is functionally indistinguishable from Nazi Germany.
No, that's
what I say is that if one wants to pursue...
I want to zero in.
Yeah. So
if
I
by
would
blowing
disagree
up
with
a
the
troop train, we prevent 5,000 American soldiers from going to Vietnam to participate in what you do explicitly call a criminal war,
right.
Isn't that a moral act?
Oh, I think that, yes, it would be. If sabotage would, in fact, contribute to ending the war, I would be in favor of sabotage. And let me give you some concrete examples.
So that's a tactical decision, not a moral
decision. In fact, I'll give you some examples. What the Berrigans have done, for example, at Catonsville and Milwaukee, I think is very heroic and, in fact, saintly.
But that is not killing American soldiers.
Oh, no, I'm not. Well, you were talking about sabotage.
I'm talking about blowing up a troop train. I would assume there'll be loss of life.
I'm sorry. I thought you meant, let's say, stop preventing a train from going.
No, I mean blowing up. I mean sabotage, assassination. What all the heroes in America.
I would first of all make a sharp distinction, as for example the Berrigans did, between attacks on property and attacks on people.
That's what I want to know.
Fundamental distinction. But then, you see, if one raises the question about attacks on people, then I think there are very tricky issues. See, I can concede, I would have been against assassinating Hitler, for example, because I'm against murder. But if I believed that assassination of Hitler would have really contributed to the end of to ending the war, I think one could have given an argument. Now, if it were true,
Mutatis Lyndon Johnson?
And that would pertain to Lyndon Johnson. But in neither case, incidentally, do I think that it tactically would have. And
Ms. Hockman.
I would like to ask Mr. Buckley what he thinks the motives of the people who are in favor of the war in Vietnam are. Putting it very simply, how can we possibly hope to help universal misery when we are so miserable here?
Well, I think we're less miserable here. I mean, you may not be a happy young lady, but I'm sure you're not as miserable as you would be if, for instance, you didn't have a free press, if you weren't able to write such poetry as you wanted to write, if you couldn't join a labor union, if you couldn't express yourself as you liked, if the mayor of your town might be disemboweled tomorrow. I think that there are observable differences between the nature, between what freedom you have here, or put it this way, between your misery and theirs.
If you wouldn't have saturation bombing take place in your village.
I want to disagree with you for the moment, because I think that there is a certain condition, a human condition, the condition of guilt, which Mr. Chomsky speaks about, and which for me is the most interesting point of his argument. The guilt that we feel here, which in a way may keep people from writing poetry or from writing anything that they think, because they're absolutely stifled by the climate of guilt.
And get on the best out of this.
Excuse me?
They manage to write their complaints.
But I know of many people who are not writing now because of the war in Vietnam, who are not functioning because of their guilt.
Well, it's not an aspect of my responsibility for foreign policy to encourage you to externalize your complaints. But if you want to, there are any number of book publishers, magazine publishers, and radio stations, television stations who are glad to hear them out, which I think is qualitatively different from what exists, for instance, in North Vietnam.
Or South.
Or Greece,
not
for
quite
example,
so much.
or Brazil, or a dozen other countries.
A little bit less so, sure.
Less so?
I think it's true.
No, it's not true.
Then publishing
No, wait a
is
minute.
the
I'll tell
only
you what's
motive.
true. What's true is that a nation at war does not have the same amount of liberties as a nation at peace. Abraham Lincoln suspended the right to habeas corpus,
Yeah.
And the oldest parliament in the history of the world didn't have an election for 11 years during
Yes,
their
you know,
war.
if you compare the state of freedom in North and South Vietnam prior to the war, as some people have done, like Joseph Buttinger, I'm afraid it doesn't come out the way you like.
Well, I think it does come out the way.
Not by the evidence that's been
Ask the
presented.
refugees who, or number of the refugees who left North Vietnam, and compare them with those who left South Vietnam.
That's a very different issue. What I was talking about is the right of free expression in North and South Vietnam. I mean, take a look, for example, at Buttinger's analysis, you know, where he runs through cases. Quite apart from that, take a look at, for example, again, you know, pick your authority. I mean, let it be Bernard Fall, let it be almost anyone you like. See, there's a great amount of village democracy which was instituted in North Vietnam, and in fact has also been instituted in the Aleff-dominated areas of South Vietnam, which is something qualitatively different than anything that has existed in Asian societies before. And this exists simultaneously with, let me be quite clear, this exists simultaneously with a good deal of repression and certainly not civil liberties of the sort that we're used to.
Chomsky, one of the most libertarian constitutions in the history of the world was written by the Soviet Union in
I'm not talking about
1936.
constitutions, I'm talking
My
about
point
facts.
is, what kind of freedom is experienced by somebody in North Vietnam? The answer is that the freedom is perpetually insecure.
Oh, well, you don't know
for
that.
reasons,
You see,
I
what
know
you
that
have
Ho Chi Minh himself has wept over the occasional necessity to kill 40, 50,000 of his own
Not the
countrymen.
necessity, the occasional fact. But just one moment, though.
sarcastic.
What I was talking, very, not only sarcastic, but also wrong. And you see, it's very important to recognize, if you want to understand what communism means in Southeast Asia, to realize that along with many authoritarian and repressive practices, which I certainly don't condone, there is on the side a great deal of democratization. There's been a liberation of energies and involvement.
Utter nonsense, if I may say so.
I don't think you're right.
After all, the great paradigm of Red China, in which the AFL-CIO itself concedes to something in the neighborhood of 20 million victims on that particular coup. I'm talking, according to them. Or perhaps they didn't ask you whether that was correct.
The AFL-CIO
but they did have a commission out there.
No one has claimed the million people killed through Chinese communist purges. Absolutely no one.
Well,
no one serious, at least.
It was published in the New Leader.
Fine.
Which
well, the New Leader, yes,
serious,
of course, the New Leader might. I mean, but I'm talking about
CIA plant.
Well, I said no one serious has. Take a look at the China Journal.
Well,
take a look at China Quarterly.
I consider this.
But you see, I think you're missing the point, really, and I think it's an important point. See, I think in looking at China, one has to recognize a great deal of repressive practice, a great deal of authoritarianism, and one also has to recognize a great deal of spontaneous democratic structure of a sort which never existed in Asia before, and if you want to know the truth, to some extent doesn't even exist in our society. Now, these things exist side by side.
If you read A Day in the Life of
Ivan
Ivan Denisovich, you find out that there's an extraordinary democratic structure even inside concentration camps. But it seems to me that it's almost profane to make this observation.
I think it's profane to make that analogy, because I'm talking about true democracy in which...
I don't think so.
Look, in which people, the peasants who live in a village control the institutions of their lives. They control the organization.
If you want to get out, you bump into the Berlin Wall on either side of the...
There's no Berlin Wall in China.
There's the equivalent of a Berlin Wall. There's the sea, and there's starvation, the concentration
No, there's no...
camps.
That's just the point. You see, starvation has been very largely overcome in China.
Yeah, because they have something like 94% of people working on agriculture. But I think Mr. Doxey has a question for you.
They also happen to have 2 bumper crops in the last 2 years.
Professor Chomsky, when you say, as you said about 30 minutes ago, that there's a relativity of truth between nations, would you classify...
A relativity of truth? I don't know.
Relativity of truth, you said, in the international scene.
I don't understand the comment. If I said it, I don't know what it means.
Well, would you call yourself a political... Would you call yourself a political relativist?
I don't understand the concept.
Well, put it this way. Do you believe in a natural law, in transcendental truth, let's say, fixing social union?
I think that there's something to the doctrine of natural law, but I think that that's much more abstract than anything we've been discussing here.
Well, but wouldn't that then justify the use of terror in, let's say, stopping a tenet of the natural law from being broken, or stopping, let's say, the ends from...
Let's bring it down to earth. I see, I'm, of course, opposed to terror. Any rational person is. But I think that if we're serious about the question of terror, if we're serious about the question of violence, we have to recognize that that it is a tactical and hence moral matter. Incidentally, tactical issues are basically moral issues. They have to do with human consequences, and if we're interested in, let's say, diminishing the amount of violence in the world, it's at least arguable, and perhaps even sometimes true, that a terroristic act does diminish the amount of violence in the world. Hence, a person who is opposed to violence will not be opposed to that terroristic act.
Walt Rostow says exactly the same thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now,
And he happens to be wrong in the case in which he applies it.
No,
you see, these principles tell you very little about real cases.
No, but that's what's, I must say, that's the one thing that bothers me more about what you've been saying than the way you write. That kind of language, that is the notion of a terroristic act which restricts consequent violence, is precisely what Rostow says in The View from the Seventh Floor, when after this whole analysis about the moral world, he says there's not a single place where we don't have major military might to support it.
I think that the real point here is that when you try to formulate general principles that will apply to arbitrary political affairs, you find that you can only make very vacuous and empty statements. See, if one wants to talk in perfect abstraction from any real situation about the justification for violence and terror, then you come up with platitudes and empty remarks and so on. The point is that, you know, there are no very general principles that apply to such circumstances, or if there are, no one has enunciated and formulated them. So what one really has to do is look at the concrete historical situation. Now, where I would disagree, maybe Rostow and I would agree at this level of abstraction on the use of violence to prevent less violence, greater violence. Where we would disagree is in our evaluation of what is happening in this concrete historical situation.
So therefore,
and that's where one's attention ought to be.
So therefore, you have no philosophical objection to the way in which Mr. Rostow states his case, merely to its applicability in existing circumstances.
No, I say at this level, I might not. I don't know what he says
but
about
he wouldn't
that.
Other things.
But in other things, I have very great difference. For example, Walt Rostow says that we should try to strengthen, that the great threat of China to us is that it will succeed and provide a model to other countries. And we have to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Is that why you kept him out of MIT?
I assure you that I had nothing to do with keeping him out of MIT. I'd be delighted to have him back. He's a great help to us when he's around.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chomsky, and thank you all.